I was standing in my kitchen, elbow deep in dishwater, when the phone rang at 6:47 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the microwave clock out of habit, the way you do when a call feels wrong before you even answer it. Claire Whitfield? The voice on the other end asked. Speaking. This is Nurse Agarwal from St. Miriam's. I'm calling about your father. I set the plate down in the sink so slowly, it didn't even clink against the others. My father and I hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not since the argument in his driveway. The one where I told him I was done trying. Done waiting for an apology that was never going to come. To understand why that drive felt like the longest of my life, you have to understand my father, Walter Whitfield, and the particular kind of silence he carried like a second skin. My father was not a cruel man. He never raised his hand to me, never raised his voice in the way some fathers do. His cruelty, if you could even call it that, was quieter. It was the empty chair at every school play. It was the birthday cards that arrived a week late, signed simply Dad. No note. No warmth. For the better part of a decade, my relationship with my father existed mostly over the phone, in calls that lasted 4 minutes and covered the weather, my job, and whether I'd eaten enough vegetables that week. I'd visit twice a year, Christmas and his birthday in July. And each time I left those visits feeling smaller than when I arrived. I got married at 26 to Daniel, a soft-spoken structural engineer who made me laugh more in our first 6 months together than my father had in 26 years. My father came to the wedding, sat in the second row between 2 cousins I barely knew, gave a handshake instead of a hug when I asked him to walk me down the aisle, and left before the cake was cut, citing a headache. I remember standing in my wedding dress in the parking lot afterward, my veil catching in the wind, watching his taillights disappear down the road, and feeling a grief I couldn't properly name. Grieving, I had always thought, requires losing something. And I wasn't sure I had ever really had him to lose in the first place, which somehow made the ache worse, not better. You can mourn a person who is still alive. I learned that lesson slowly, over many such moments. My mother-in-law, of all people, found me out there in the cold, mascara starting to run. And without a single question, simply put her coat over my shoulders and stood beside me until I was ready to go back inside. I remember thinking with a strange, sharp clarity,
that a near stranger had just shown me more instinctive warmth in 5 minutes than my father had managed in 5 years.
St. Miriam's smelled like antiseptic and boiled coffee. The particular hospital smell that instantly transports you back to every difficult moment you've ever had in a building like it. Nurse Agarwal met me at the front desk. A kind-eyed woman in her 50s who put a hand on my arm. Before she even spoke. I drove to his house that same night, using the spare key I'd kept for 11 years out of habit more than sentiment. The house was exactly as I remembered. Dim, quiet, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco he'd quit 20 years ago, but whose scent seemed to have soaked permanently into the walls. Under his bed, exactly where he said, was a wooden box. Old, scuffed at the corners, the kind you'd keep tools in. I sat on the floor of his bedroom and opened it. And what I found inside changed everything I thought I understood about my father. Letters. Dozens of them. Some yellowed with age. Some more recent. All addressed in his careful, blocky handwriting to Claire. But none of them stamped. None of them sent. Just folded, dated, and kept. I opened the first one, dated the year my mother died. Claire. I don't know how to be your father without her. I'm so afraid I'll do it wrong. And you'll grow up thinking I didn't love you enough to try harder. I love you more than I know how to say out loud. I just don't know how to say it at all. Dad. My hands were shaking by the second letter. Claire. You made honor roll again today. And I sat in the car outside your school for 10 minutes trying to figure out how to walk in and tell you how proud I am without falling apart in front of you. I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. There was one from the night of my wedding. Claire. I left early tonight because if I'd stayed, everyone would have seen me cry. And I didn't want to take that from you. Not on your day. You looked so much like your mother in that dress that I could barely breathe. I am the proudest father in that entire room. And I could not find one single way to say it. There was one from the day Micah was born. Claire. I held your son today and felt something I haven't felt in 30 years. I wanted to stay longer. I wanted to hold him until my arms ached. But I am so bad at showing what's inside me
that I made an excuse about your mother's chin, and handed him back before I embarrassed myself. I don't know how to unlearn 30 years of silence. I am trying.
I drove back to the hospital at 11 that night, with the box on the passenger seat beside me, like a passenger of its own. My father was awake when I walked in, the machines still beeping their steady rhythm. He looked at my face, swollen, red-eyed, and then at the box in my arms. And something in him seemed to understand immediately. You read them. All of them.
He didn't die that night or the next. Against the odds his doctors had quietly prepared me for, my father held on for 11 more days. And in those 11 days, we did the thing we had never managed to do in 31 years. We talked. Really talked. He told me about his own father, a hard, silent man from a hard, silent generation, who taught him that love was something you demonstrated through providing, never through saying. He told me about the year my mother got sick, how watching her disappear had frightened him so completely that he'd built walls around his heart just to survive it, and then simply forgotten how to take them back down once she was gone. On the 5th day, I asked him about my mother, really asked, in a way I never had before. He told me about the day they met, at a county fair when he was 22, how she'd beaten him at a ring toss game and refused to let him live it down for the entire 31 years of their marriage. He laughed while he told me this, an actual laugh, the kind I couldn't remember hearing from him since before she got sick. She was the one who made me feel things out loud, he admitted. I didn't know how to do it on my own. When she died, I think I forgot the instructions came with her. On the 7th day, he apologized for the swim meet. I hadn't even brought it up. I'm not sure I even remembered mentioning it in all our years apart. But somehow, lying there with all that time to think, he'd landed on that exact memory himself. Parents' night, he said suddenly, apropos of nothing, while I was refilling his water. Regionals, your freshman year. I told you I had. My father passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning, 11 days after that first phone call, with my hand in his and Micah's baby blanket, the one he'd asked me to bring, tucked beside his pillow. His final words to me were simple. Thank you for coming back. I held his hand until the machines went quiet, and then I sat with him for a long while after, in a silence that finally, for the first time in my entire life, didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace. We buried my father on a bright, almost unreasonably beautiful Saturday morning, the kind of crisp autumn day where the sky seems to mock the grief happening beneath it. I had expected a small gathering, a handful of co-workers from the plant, a cousin or two, the same thin crowd that had populated his life for the last 3 decades. Instead, nearly 80 people showed up. I stood at the front of that small chapel, stunned, as person after person came up to me with stories I had never heard. A young man named Peter, who used to work the line beside my father, told me how Walter had quietly covered his rent for 2 months during a rough patch years ago and never once brought it up again or expected repayment. An older woman named Ruth, a neighbor 3 houses down, told me my father had shoveled her driveway every single snowfall for 11 years after her husband passed, always before 6 in the morning, always without being asked, always slipping away before she could properly thank him. He never said much, Ruth told me, her eyes wet. But he showed up. Every single time. It wasn't until several weeks after the funeral that Daniel told me something that reframed the entire year for me all over again. We were sitting on our back porch one evening, the box of letters between us on the little wooden table, and I asked him, almost offhandedly, whether he'd ever suspected my father felt more than he showed. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember the night before our wedding?" he asked. "The rehearsal dinner?" I did, vaguely. A blur of nervous energy and too much wine, and my father sitting at the edge of the room, as he always did at gatherings, present but somehow separate from everyone around him separate. "I went outside for some air near the end of the night," Daniel said, "and your dad was already out there, alone, looking up at the sky. I almost turned around and left him be, but he saw me and waved me over. He didn't say much, but right before we went back inside, he told me, 'Take care of her better than I did.' I asked him what he meant, and he just said, 'You'll understand what I mean eventually. I hope you never have to understand it the way I did.' I never told you because I didn't fully understand it myself, not until this year." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. My father had known, even back then, exactly what he had failed to give me. He'd carried that awareness for years, quietly, painfully, without ever finding the words to close the distance himself, except, apparently, to a near stranger